for Lesson 6.09, A War on All Fronts. In this lesson, you're going to be picking up with the Civil War after its official end at Appomattox Courthouse, the surrender of General Lee to Ulysses S. Grant of the Union. And it picks up talking about some different aspects of the aftermath of the war and talking about why the war itself was so deadly and some of the technological advances as well that lent to it being such a deadly and destructive war. The goals for this lesson are to recognize reasons for considering the Civil War the first modern war, to identify the events and impact of Lincoln's assassination, and explore the impact of photography during the Civil War. The pages covered in this lesson are pages 433 to 441, and there is a reading guide for this particular lesson. If you go to the next slide, you'll see where to download your reading guide. Print these off and use these to answer key questions as you read so that you can identify important information and also identify where your understanding on a topic may break down. That's a good time to recognize what information you need to come to me with to ask any particular questions. Once you have your reading guide ready, and you're ready to go into the textbook, open up your textbook to page 433, and you'll see that your reading section starts with the first modern war. It's going to be talking about a lot of different technology that came about during the war that changed the way the war was fought, including the change from a smoothbore musket to one that had grooves in the barrel that allowed for greater accuracy, that caused a lot more deaths. Also during the war, the repeating rifle became a common weapon and greatly increased the ability for somebody to shoot several times at higher accuracy. There were also different things used for surveillance, like hot air balloons for aerial reconnaissance, which means basically scoping out a situation from the air. Reconnaissance is acquiring information. And it was also used in spying. There were a lot of different spying technologies used during this time period as well. Okay. Also, as you'll get into a little bit later in this reading, there were a lot of advances in medicine during the Civil War as well. So at the start of the Civil War, there wasn't as much available, but out of necessity, and then understanding that there was a lot of pain and suffering and a lot of loss of limbs and life during the war, there were lots of medical advances as well. So this was truly one of the first modern wars, and we saw that with the Merrimack and the Monitor, the first ironclads fighting each other, and lots of different examples of how technology advanced the war forward. Also the use of railroads to supply lines, the use of the telegraph to transport and communicate commands back and forth also made it a very modern war. Something else that also added to that was photography during the war. Mathew Brady is one of the photographers that's most often associated with the Civil War because of his work in photographing battlefields during the war. He also had frequently photographed President Lincoln as well, so his images are very famous. One of the things Brady and other photographers were known for, though, during the war was going out to a battle site and rearranging bodies and rearranging the scene to tell a tale. So some of the photographs that we see are legitimate and were as they were, but others were a little bit more staged. So that was part of the situation as well. After the Civil War and during the Civil War, there were a lot of different pieces of legislation that went through the government system under President Lincoln that really changed society at the time. And one of the things that happened during the Civil War was a change in the way that taxes were enacted. There was the first income tax put into place during the war because of the cost of it. They also started using what they call greenbacks, or the new paper bills, more similar to what we have today. So that was the onset of using that kind of currency. In addition to that, they passed a lot of laws that had to do with expansion of the country, like the Homestead Act, which would grant 160 acres of free land in the West to any settler who lived on his parcel for 5 years or more. So if you settled somewhere and claimed that land for 5 years and developed it, you were able to claim that land, and that really pushed settlement further and further west. It also provided for the transcontinental railroad. Lincoln was very much interested in the transcontinental railroad, and that was part of what he ran on in the 1860 election. The Morrill Act provided each loyal state with land for specific colleges as well. So the Morrill Act was working on beefing up the country's education system, post-secondary education. There had been public education only for a short time in the United States, as we read in the Reform era, but Lincoln was trying to expand that and create more college offerings for the United States as well. So you can see that the role of the federal government is expanding. They're doing a lot of different things, and it really helped promote changes in the country with education, with transportation, as far as finances, so a lot was going on. In this section, April 1865, you will learn a bit about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. Booth did assassinate President Lincoln on April 14th, 1865 in Ford's Theater. And this is going to go over the details of that. He was captured and apprehended despite the claims of some conspiracy theorists. It is pretty widely known that he was found and captured but killed in the scuffle between himself and law enforcement. This next portion of your reading is going to go over women and the Civil War. On the home front, there was an emotional burden as well as a financial burden. Trying to make ends meet on the home front when men were away at war was very, very difficult. In fact, getting food or supplies of any kind, especially in the South, was very, very difficult. So women were really left in many circumstances to come together and try to work to make ends meet, as you'll see here in the other page. And this is a trend in U.S. history. When the U.S. went to war, women went into the workforce. But when the war ended, frequently women were told to go back into the home and become primarily mothers and carers of the household. So frequently women would change roles during time of war. Now, lower class women who were in the working class did typically work anyway in industrialized jobs, but this simply expanded during wartime. There were also a lot of challenges for African American women specifically, and we're going to be reading about that in this particular piece, especially after the war. Especially if you had a spouse who was fighting for the Union, there was still a lot of racism in the North as well as in the South. So life during and after the Civil War did not just immediately become easier with the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. There were still a lot of obstacles to overcome. Caring for the sick and wounded, you're going to learn about some key individuals, including key women who really helped establish nursing and sanitation commissions within the United States for these efforts to improve hospital and nursing care during the Civil War. So we have things like discussing Clara Barton and her role in the Red Cross, and Sally Tompkins, and quite a few other people here that they're going to be discussing as far as sanitation and nursing care was concerned. Women played a huge role in that. Writing and speaking out was also something that women frequently did and are a great primary source for historians when they look back to learn more about the Civil War. Women also served as soldiers and spies. This is something that's not frequently talked about. They're referred to more as spies, than they are as soldiers. Women did hide themselves as men and fight in the Civil War, usually because either their home was destroyed or their husband went to war, their brothers, their fathers, and they were basically left to fend for themselves. So rather than be alone with no source of income or food or any other way to support themselves, they followed the men in their community to war. It didn't happen frequently, but it did happen enough, and sadly is not frequently enough recognized. Even today, we're still learning more about that. Women and dissent, talking about their positions during the war, and their dissatisfaction with the fact that the war continued for so long, putting a additional burden on them as well as the men who were fighting the war. Everybody suffered during this time period. And then finally going over the war's legacy for women. What did it mean for them? How did it change their life and their situations? And that's going to wrap up your reading for this lesson. Once you finish your reading and you've completed your reading guide, make sure that you've circled anything or you've made any notes on your reading guide of anything that you don't understand, so that you can come to office hours and clarify with me for that. Okay, so it's going to talk a little bit more within your lesson slides about Mathew Brady, his images and his imagination. It's going to talk about what he did, what he photographed primarily during the war, and show you a few examples of his work. And here's another example of his work, a photograph by Brady of the 23rd New York Infantry. And this is also a link to the National Archives, where you'll be able to see a lot of different examples of Brady's work. And of course, he was also known for doing a lot of portraits, including those of Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. So you can see primary resource examples. Photographs are a primary resource because they come from that particular time. So something like Brady's work would definitely be a primary resource. Okay, we also have photos here of Clara Barton and Mary Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's wife. And more pictures in Mathew Brady's gallery. So there's lots to look at here and to consider what photographs tell us about the people who are captured in them. The end of this lesson, you'll see chapter highlights as well. Make sure that you go over these because it's a good summary of what you have gone over in chapter 18. And it gives you a good point-by-point summary to go over before preparing for a test. That goes over the next couple slides. Finally, it will give you a reminder on slide 12 that you do have a quiz for 6.09. So please be sure to go into your quiz underneath the 6.09 lesson and complete that quiz for credit. If you have any questions at all, please be sure to contact me.